Okay. Okay, colleagues here and there. Those of us who are on campus for today's Department of Classics seminar meeting have moved to another room. Another room brings all sorts of technological challenges. My co-head of department, Barbara Goff, is ably admitting people into the online space. Thank you, Barbara. Even though she's pretending she's sitting in the Year Museum, she's here with us. We have one potential audio thing, which is that our very enriched PowerPoint presentation today has some embedded audio. The bad news is that we're not sure if you're going to be able to hear that audio. The good news is, even if you can't, it's going to repeat what's on the screen anyway. So we'll be okay in that regard. And we are delighted to welcome many other parts of the world, as well as here in Reading, to this presentation, to hear our own Dr. Oliver Baldwin. We were lucky in the middle of lockdown, actually, to meet Oliver for the first time when the British Academy brought him to us as a postdoctoral fellow. So he's here with us for a second year, and it's a great joy to finally get to meet someone who you've met originally online and feel like you know them very well already. He's currently working on a project called Queer Tragedy, and I hope you will see some ways in which today's presentation relates to that very nicely. But it's an international performance and cultural history of queer stagings of Greco-Roman tragedy between 1969 and 2019. 2019, an interesting and important cutoff that I suppose started with the origin of the project. It's time at which to have cut off staging. It's a new history from here on out. And unsurprisingly, he's working with our Professor Barbara Goff, our expert in Greek tragedy. He was awarded a PhD from King's College London, August 2019, coincidentally, under the supervision of Professor Edith Hall, with a thesis on Seneca's Medea in Republican Spain, that actually, in the meantime, was awarded with the best thesis prize of the Association of Hispanists of Great Britain and Ireland. I hope that means more than people who actually are interested in Hispanic things in Great Britain and Ireland, because that's rather an important international group of scholars. And Oliver has spoken and published primarily on classical reception in 20th century Spain and queer versions of tragedy, but has to date published several other articles, including a gay version of Medea in the 1980s in Spain. And he's currently preparing also an article on Black, queer, and trans version of Euripides' Trojan Women. His chapter on queer time and the Rhesus is going to appear in Queer Euripides, which is being edited by Mario Telo and Sarah Olson, to be published in 2022. Do we believe that?
Yes, I mean, we do.
Everything that was supposed to be published in 2021 is coming out in 22, so who knows what's... Anyway, so we're very much looking forward to that. And his book on Seneca's Medea and the Second Spanish Republic, which, as you can realize if you've been paying attention to any of this, comes out of his PhD thesis, is expected also to be out early in 22 with Timesis. And they're usually on time, so that might actually work. Anyway, much about what Oliver has done brings us to what he's going to do today, and we're delighted to welcome him to speak to us today on Medea. On with the show, Oliver. And thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I am going to share the PowerPoint presentation, but it's going to be without sound for those of you at home, because there was a bit of a technical difficulty, which meant that it didn't quite work. But as Amy has said, all the text will be on your screen anyway on the PowerPoint, and you might be able to hear the wonderful Tom Hewitt in the background somewhere to give you a kind of feeling of how wonderful his voice is. Anyway, here we are. So let me just... Sorry, this is very bad rehearsal. I just need to know how far I can move for you guys to be able to see. Okay, I can move until here, and I can move until here. Good, okay, good. Fantastic. Now, finally. So, since this is, hello everyone. Since this is the first time that I'm actually talking at my home department of the Classics Department, University of Reading, I guess it's a good idea to give you an overview of what the project actually is. As Amy has explained, it is a cultural and performance history of LGBTQI plus stagings and versions of Greco-Roman tragedy from 1969, which is the year of Stonewall, until 2019, which is 50 years later. I am perfectly aware of the problems with Stonewall as being a kind of a cut in the history, in queer history, but you have to cut somewhere. So that's the place that I decided to cut. It is also a global performance and cultural history. That means that it is not only about versions that happen in the English-speaking world, but also in other countries and in other languages. The richness of it is unbelievable, and things are just popping up almost every week. So we've got trans, gay, queer, and lesbian Medeas. We've got lesbian and gay Oedipuses. We have lesbian, trans, non-binary Antigones. We have Black, trans, queer Trojan women, etc., 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 from any time between 1969 and 2019, and in many, many countries. What I bring to you today is a bit of a work in progress still, sadly. I mean, there's a lot of work that has to be done, on the background of a lot of these issues, but that has already some shape, of course. If not, it would be a bit silly, which is one of the gay Medeas in the kind of the collection of queer tragedy. Before I start, I would like to take the opportunity for those at home as well to thank the Classics Department at the University of Reading for being such a wonderful home and such welcoming home for queer tragedy. I am going to read, just because, as you can probably feel by now, I go on and on and on and on and on. So just to keep myself a bit, within the reins, I'm going to read from now on. So, Another Medea was first performed in New York in 2013, written and directed by Aaron Mark and acted by Tom Hewitt, being later restaged in 2015 by the same artistic team and subsequently in new productions in Chicago and Holland. The production I shall focus on here is the Mark Hewitt production of 2013-2015. I apologize, I strongly apologize actually for how ruthlessly, and even more for the author who is somewhere in there in cyberspace, for spoiling the plot of the play. But I need to do that in order for you to understand my discussion. In the 90-minute monologue that constitutes Another Medea, an unnamed actor visits a fellow actor he once knew, Marcus Sharp, who is in prison for some horrendous crime. Hewitt then performs the role of Marcus as he narrates to the actor his story. Marcus Sharp explains that he once was a penniless and promiscuous actor living in Queens with insalubrious flatmates until he met backstage a charming and rich English doctor, Jason Russell. They soon get together and Jason convinces him to move in with him and not to worry about money. He cannot believe his luck. But everything begins to quiet down and sour into domesticity. Marcus gets offered to play in Charles Ludlam's version of Medea and in Jesus Christ Superstar, incidentally a musical in which Hewitt himself had performed. But Jason convinces him to decline both offers. As a result, Marcus loses his agent and therefore his main line into his profession. Marcus is now completely isolated, and it is a distant and manipulative Jason all that remains. To show Jason his love, he wants to have a baby with Jason's sister, Angelica, as a 50th birthday present. The idea is to mix both DNAs. Angelica accepts, they undertake IVF, and she becomes pregnant with twins. Although reluctant at first, Jason is delighted to be a father, which he had always dreamt of. But the twins, Grace and Lily, only help to convince Marcus only help to confine Marcus to their home even more. One day, Jason and Marcus have a date to see a play in which a very attractive young actor, Paris List, is performing. Jason is clearly besotted with Paris, and he invites him and his mother to the apartment. Soon after, Paris begins babysitting the twins, displacing Marcus from his only meaningful role as a housekeeper and carer of his children. His suspicions are soon revealed. Jason is moving back to England with Paris, Angelica, and the twins. When Marcus reclaims his status as partner to Jason and father to Grace and Lily, Jason accuses him of being a drama queen and, most shockingly, of being just a sperm donor. He must move out immediately, although he can stay at Angelica's place for the time being. In his despair, isolation, and powerlessness, Marcus realizes the similarities of his case with that of Medea, which he was once meant to perform. He goes on to research more about the Colchian princess, growing in sympathy and identification with her. As a note by Jason appears warning him that his stay at Angelica's apartment is to end, Marcus, desperate, takes the route of Medea. He kills Jason's paramour, Paris, and eventually drowns the twins and Jason in the bath. Marcus takes full responsibility of what he and Medea have done. To appeal to insanity or Greek myth would be to forget that these horrors are real and are happening all around us. The actor finally confesses he is still haunted by this story, which affects every part of his life. The play ends. Again, I truly apologize about the spoilers, but as with Greek tragedy, the power of another Medea is not so much in the what, but in the how of the play. As you can appreciate from this short summary, Aaron Mark has been able to write yet another Medea that spins with horror, intelligence, and dramatic skill the story of the Black Sea filicide and sorceress into a story of a gay couple in New York City, in which manipulation, isolation, otherness, displacement, paternity rights, marital allegiances, and filicide maintain and even expand the potency they possess in the Euripidean and Senecan tragedies. The timing of, I'm sorry, because it's a long time to be just on the introductory slide. But the timing of the first performances of Another Medea coincide with a crucial time period for same-sex marriage and its concomitant issues of same-sex parenting and divorce in the United States. The first run of Another Medea took place just a couple of months before the decision of United States v. Windsor that repealed part of the 1996 Defense of Marriage Act in June 2013, which largely banned the Defense of Marriage Act largely banned same-sex marriage, thus making same-sex marriage possible in individual states. The play returned for a short second run in October that same year, after the decision. It was then restaged in January 2015, months before the US Supreme Court decided, in Obergefell v. Hodges, to guarantee same-sex marriage in the whole of the United States of America. Therefore, the subject matter, development, and staging of Another Medea appear as most topical in thinking through, questioning, and highlighting the debate on same-sex marriage in the United States before it became legal in the entire nation, as well as concomitant issues of homosexual relationships and gay parenting. This was at the heart of Aaron Mark's decision to adapt Medea. He says, "In the original, Medea is an outsider with no legal rights, and I thought that we could do that in the present day with two gay men." It is for these reasons that I will here briefly focus on three aspects which are pivotal to the importance of Medea to Another Medea and its context within queer history and culture: heterosexist models of toxic masculinity and domestic abuse, same-sex marriage, and gay parenting. Let me warn you that some may find what I will be discussing emotionally upsetting or triggering. I also warn you of the great amount of swearing in the quotes today. John Russell, in Another Medea, is the dream man, a handsome, very wealthy, mature oncologist with the added sexiness of a British accent, of course. Good taste in wine and a penthouse overlooking the Hudson River.
who would not fall for him. Marcus, on the other hand, is penniless. He is struggling to make it in the theatre, and he is tired of working in Broadway flops and in a bar. He's almost 40 and lives with 2 flatmates who are also poor and addicted to drugs. When Jason appears in his life, takes an interest in him, and asks him to move in, the doctor does indeed seem to be the knight in a shining white coat Marcus needed. As he himself explains, he says, "So before I know it, it's been 3 months and we haven't had so much as a tiff," as he says. And I start thinking, my God, maybe this is what people are talking about. Maybe this is what everybody's looking for. A mate. That's what it feels like. I found a fucking mate. But the dream slowly turns into something much darker. The signs are there from the beginning. The socioeconomic imbalance, at least, is clear when Jason insisted that Marcus should not worry about paying to stay in the apartment, since it is his and he is too wealthy to need rent from Marcus, adding, "Let me help you to care for yourself." Marcus has entered an unequal relationship, but he does need a break, and Jason seems to be caring for him, and he is grateful. He says, Have I ever done anything in my life to deserve that? Jason also convinces him to reject the offer of playing Medea in Charles Ludlam's version, making him dependent not only in his accommodation, but also in his own economic means. But to Marcus, this is a man with whom he is building something he has never had, a home. And I think you can hear this probably. Marcus takes his new role as housekeeper. Oh, okay, that's probably because there's a message. Okay. So Marcus takes his new role as a housekeeper with gusto, but domesticity starts to creep in. Jason's interest in him seems to diminish, and he is so bored of being at home all the time. Their sex life also diminishes, and his domestic isolation, and in his domestic isolation, he starts to become insecure, anxious, full of worries. Marcus is totally aware that if he loses Jason, he has nowhere and nothing to go to. But Jason is able to convince him that all this is not true and calms him down. Marcus sees this as proof of Jason's patience and his own neuroticism. Marcus is again convinced into rejecting another offer to play in Jesus Christ Superstar, a rejection that ends his relationship with his agent, Judy. He is now internalizing Jason's manipulation. He says, "I did what we decided. I didn't take the job." Marcus has interiorized Jason's subtle and charming gaslighting, and he is now completely isolated with no job, no friends or connections, and no family, since he is long estranged from his mother. Jason is all he has. The same as Medea in Euripides and Seneca, stands isolated both in her lack of family network, since she severed all ties with her family by killing her own brother Absyrtus, and in her banishment from both her home with Jason and Corinth. So is Marcus now fully isolated and gradually cornered. He has rejected his home in Queens, his job and his agent, and we learn he does not speak to his mother anymore. Marcus decides his world is Jason, and as such, he must please him, even by giving him what Jason has always wanted, children. Jason's sister, as you know, Angelica, agrees to be the mother of the children. Marcus' psychological dependency and isolation is revealed just after Jason rejoices at the news, after some reluctance. Marcus explains, and the voice in my head is louder and clearer than it's ever been, and it's saying, now I've got him for good. The twins are born, and Marcus is truly in love with them. He plays daddy as efficiently as he's played housekeeper. He is the only one in charge of the babies and makes every effort to save Jason the hassle of child rearing. In Seneca, it becomes pivotally clear that Medea has relinquished her past identity as Colchian princess and sorceress in favor of her identity as wife to Jason and mother of his children. So Marcus, no longer an actor, is now fully invested in his identity as partner to Jason and father of his children. But the relationship between Jason and Marcus, as with Jason and Medea, is about to be irreparably damaged. To rekindle their relationship, Marcus and Jason go to the theatre to see Paris Liszt, with whom Jason is besotted. In response to Marcus' reluctance that Paris babysits the twins, Jason reveals again his patronizing and manipulative ways. You really could do with some time to yourself after all this, Jason explains. Jason knows what is best. Marcus has no choice. As is often the case with abusive and manipulative male partners, Jason sheds his mask of English well-groomed charm when Marcus confronts his decision to take the twins and go to England with Paris, leaving Marcus dispossessed, alone, and unable to fend for himself. Abuse, control, manipulation, and disdain can no longer be disguised with apparent charm, understanding, care, and protection. As with the tragic Medea, Marcus has now been fully isolated, cornered, abandoned, insulted, and rejected. As with Medea, who sacrificed her family, herself, and her powers to be Jason's wife, companion, and mother to his children, Marcus sees in the killing of the children the way to save the twins their future pain, to annihilate the family Jason is forsaking, and to hurt Jason by killing what he loves most. Unlike the tragic Medea, Marcus has no Athens to go to, no sun chariot to take him away. In his desperate escape forward from his isolation and trauma, Marcus sees in the example of Medea, whom he gradually obsesses about in his despair, the only way to exit his situation, bringing him to kill not only his daughters Grace and Lily, but Jason too. One of the most insightful and intelligent aspects of Another Medea is how it skillfully explores the pervasiveness of heterosexist models of toxic and abusive masculinity in society, to the point that they contaminate homosexual relationships too. Jason is a textbook case of an abusive husband, and Marcus displays many of the signs of an abused spouse. Although huge amounts of work, of course, needs to be done on its eradication, our Western liberal societies have come to identify these abusive relationships and toxic masculinities mainly in heterosexual couples. What Another Medea brings to our very own eyes is the reality that abusive partners and toxic masculinities are existent, detrimental, and corrosive in male gay couples too. This is a problem that has often been overlooked and, in the case at least of the United States, largely neglected. Toxic and abusive masculinity is not a mark of heterosexual relationships, but instead a codification of masculinity imposed by heterosexism that affects any relationship, whatever its nature. In highlighting this, another Medea also complicates the homophobic cultural trope of the homicidal gay man. Marcus, as Medea, is indeed a filicide and in killing Jason, also a murderer. But the careful grooming, manipulation, abuse, and isolation Jason has executed on Marcus illustrates the mental state that might have brought him to such horrendous acts. While Marcus is indeed homicidal, it is perhaps because Jason is the ultimate culprit in another Medea. But the isolation and abuse suffered by Marcus responds also to a legal and social lack of protection. Since he is not Jason's legal spouse, he cannot be compensated under the law for the marriage failing. That is, since they are not married, they cannot be divorced. Marcus is at the entire mercy of Jason's whims in a union that is not one of equals, be it de facto or de jure. Marcus cannot appeal to the protection of the state or the law. He is alone, completely alone. Despite same-sex marriage having been legalized in New York, where Jason and Marcus live, in 2011, 2 years before the first performance of Another Medea, the rights, benefits, and duties of same-sex marriage were not recognized in all states or at a federal level until the summer of 2013, making same-sex marriage a very much contended and precarious development in the United States, until the Supreme Court guaranteed same-sex marriage throughout the USA in 2015, months after the second run of Another Medea. To this precariousness, we must add the disregard of same-sex marriage by some, even in the queer community then, and in many cases now, as a necessary legalization of a bond already experienced in reality. Love is love, not a piece of paper, is one of the common statements in this direction. Some would even reject it as the imposition of heteronormative institution on the lives of LGBTQ people by liberal homonormativity. It might have been due to these reasons or to the relative novelty of same-sex marriage in 2013 and 2015 that none of the reviews I have consulted refer to Marcus as husband or even partner, despite Marcus and Jason having a living, economic, and interdependent arrangement that would explain the use of such terms. Nor is there a mention of boyfriend or other half or life companion. The words used to describe their relationship are either as lovers or in an affair. Despite its homophobic undertones that betray an understanding of gay men as inherently promiscuous, a lover connotes temporariness, sex and substitutability, unlike partner, I believe lover also codes Mark's lack of legal protection under marriage. He can only be seen as lover because he is treated as such by Jason, who finds a new love interest in Paris. There are no marital obligations on the side of either. Jason can use and abuse Marcus as he likes. A similar issue, of course, on marital status and its disrespect was already present in the Euripidean Medea, where for Jason, Medea is a temperamental barbarian concubine who must be cast aside for the advantages of a real Greek marriage, as Foley explains. And so Marcus is Jason's concubine of lower status, whom he rejects for the English and wealthy Paris, and therefore not Jason's legitimate partner. These homophobic undercurrents were already voiced by Marcus before he even met Jason, when he says, "So at this point, I'm well into my 30s. I've got 2 roommates in Queens, also in their 30s, also actors, of course, and the longest relationship I've ever had with a man lasted about 5 weeks. And this is fine with me, I think, because of course, I don't need any real intimacy. Honestly, I never thought I'd have that. A partner, you know, a relationship. My mother didn't have that. She made it extremely clear to me that I'd never have that. So I decide I'm happy with my friends and my life. As both Euripidean and Senecan tragedies reveal, attitudes, issues, and norms regarding marriage in Athens and Rome, so does Marcus' situation demonstrate how the recognition of same-sex marriage in the 21st century has implications beyond love as such. Love has indeed been the understandable and useful banner for the legalization of marriage between people of the same sex throughout many years and countries. We should all indeed have the right to make the legal statement and commitment of loyalty, care, support, and affection to whoever we happen to love. But marriage is also a set of legal obligations, guarantees, and safeguards that protect one and both of the spouses in the cases when love ends or it is not enough. That is, legal marriage is a prerequisite for legal divorce, something which was not guaranteed in the entirety of the US until after the final run of another Medea. Given that Marcus has no independent means, has been depending on Jason for his accommodation, subsistence, and well-being, and has been looking after the house and the children, a divorce settlement would have entitled him to some level of alimony to move beyond his relationship with Jason. It is this lack of legal protection and compensation that further worsens Marcus' isolation and dispossession, which leads him to his fatidic and horrific acts of murder. Jason has given him no plan B, but neither has the protection of the law. While what I have here discussed is not to say that Marcus and Jason may have willingly not chosen to marry, as many people do, and the consequences of this were indeed unseen, unforeseen, and or unwittingly disregarded, another Medea clearly evidences the more pragmatic, protective, and supportive aspects of the universalization of the right to marry in encoding the legal obligations of spouses to one another at a time when in the United States of America, the debate on the legalization of same-sex marriage was a topic in dispute, focused on love and companionship rather than duty and protection, a debate not resolved even after another Medea. As largely concomitant to marriage in the US, Marcus is also bereft from the protection of the law in the state in his other link to Jason, his role as co-parent of Lily and Grace. The twins have been conceived through in vitro fertilization with the sperm of Marcus and the eggs of Angelica, Jason's sister. Only Angelica is the registered parent. When Angelica and Marcus offer this arrangement to Jason as a gift for his 50th birthday, Jason at first denies being the father, calling himself instead uncle to the children. But Marcus has carefully conceived, in his complicated emotional and mental state, a device by which his DNA and Jason's own, via his sister, would be present in the twins. Marcus' device and Jason's original bafflement, signal the complications, limitations, and some theorists have claimed impossibilities of the genetic futurity of gays and lesbians, an essential discussion in much of queer theory. But Jason ultimately accepts, with joy, that he is a father of the twins. But the precarity of the parental schema that has developed is revealed by Jason at the height of the row with Marcus when he has announced he is to leave for England with Paris, Angelica, and the twins. The legal configuration of the twins' guardianship is made clear by Jason in the most brutal, dismissive, and insulting terms imaginable. These words, as well as further revealing the abuse and manipulation Jason has exercised over Marcus, point towards the larger manipulation and control that Jason has executed in the familial arrangement. It is true that Jason seems not to be the legal parent either, but as provider, he is de facto in charge of the well-being of the twins. Since he has managed to convince Marcus to relinquish his independence, Marcus cannot be counted as parent either de jure or de facto. He is not registered as parent, and he has had no economic means to provide for the twins, and he continues to have none. The method of procreation further enforces his passivity and substitutability. He has donated his sperm for the fertilization of Angelica's eggs that have resulted in a pregnancy that Angelica has endured as legal mother and not a surrogate gestator. Marcus seems to not have been registered as donor, thus not being legally recognizable as father. Angelica thus stands as the sole parent of the twins, and Jason is their provider. Jason has managed to isolate Marcus also from his most beloved daughters. He has literally stripped him from everything. Marcus' situation is once more also legally not fully protected. Parental rights for LGBTQ people have been a disputed and demanded issue for decades in the United States as elsewhere. Particularly Obergefell v. Hodges, which in granting nationwide, particularly before Obergefell v. Hodges, which in granting nationwide same-sex marriage helped in parenting disputes, but only after the final run of another Medea. If we were to scan some of the legal decisions and legislation in the US, Marcus may have indeed had some options. He could have claimed a child-parent bond with his daughters. He could have claimed a child-parent bond with his daughters, even without a legal parent designation himself, as was granted to a lesbian woman separated from the biological mother of her child in 1995. Marcus could have also asked for custody along the lines of the Supreme Court of Ohio case Rowell v. Smith in 2013, in which a lesbian woman won parental rights over a child conceived via IVF, but that she had not carried the baby. This may have been a possible parallel case given the manner of conception, but only applicable after the first run of another Medea in March 2013, since the decision on this case dates from the 30th of May 2013. Marcus may have even been declared a second parent, even despite protestations from Angelica or Jason, given his bond with and care for the twins, as well as his belonging to the family unit, as with Mancini v. Gansner, a case resolved in 2013. But all these possibilities, which I'm just giving you to show you the different complications of the different cases in order to read the law of regarding parenting in the United States. But all of these possibilities would have been problematic since Marcus' ex-partner Jason seems not to have parent status either. Marcus has also not been in a union with Angelica, the apparently only registered parent, who is actually the legal biological parent according to the Uniform Parentage Act of 2002, since no surrogacy agreement had taken place. Marcus could perhaps go to court to demand visitation rights to proving his DNA matches that of the twins, but without a pre-agreement, his case as donor father is weak. But perhaps most importantly, all these judicial options would be too costly for a man deprived of independent economic means, as well as legally difficult to effect, given that the twins would be residing in England. To this, we must add the decades of ample prejudice against LGBTQI+ parents in the US up until Obergefell in 2015, after Medea's final New York run, which are still to be largely rectified today. Yes. To Marcus' lack of legal protection and registration as parent and the role this plays in his isolation, we cannot overlook the process Marcus has undertaken as father to Grace and Lily. As seen, Marcus' first reason to have the twins was a 50th birthday present to Jason in order to tighten their relationship and thus guarantee, in his mind, Jason's fidelity and permanence. When the twins arrive, Marcus clearly sees the twins as Jason's babies, and he is delighted about how much Jason loves them. But as he looks after them, he gradually begins to identify them clearly as his daughters too, particularly Lily, who has his eyes. He begins to shift his focus from his partner Jason to the twins, aided, of course, by Jason's own behavior. When Paris, Jason's lover, begins to take an interest in the twins and they reciprocate, Marcus feels threatened in the only role and identity he has left, as father. This replicates Medea's own distrust of having her children brought up as part of the royal household with Glauca's future children in Euripides. Marcus wants no rival newcomer to usurp his position as parent. Marcus' situation also resembles Medea's own when Jason, in Euripides, explains that he will take charge of the children and that she should not worry, therefore relegating her of her role as mother. Neither Medea nor Marcus can accept this relegation. But the tragic connection is also present in Marcus' fears of a fatidic future for the twins. This fatidic future seems to be grounded on having Marcus as father, as if a genetic predestination, echoing Medea's own words in Seneca's tragedy, when she says, "The only fault is to have Jason as father, and a higher one still, to have Medea as mother." The infanticide becomes the only path for Marcus, who is trapped, stripped of all he was and is, whose only way forward is to end it all. Marcus is empowered precisely by taking control over what he has been disempowered of, his family with Jason. If his fatherhood is denied, he will exercise his fatherhood in killing the twins. But he will do so believing in the charitable and caring goal of his infanticide by sparing the horrible fate that awaits his daughters, a goal that has, for Marcus, the darkest examples in Magda Goebbels. One of the most interesting developments of Seneca's Medea is her meta-theatrical, even meta-mythical awareness of her role in literature, theatre, and myth. Medea is fully aware of the role she has to play as the sorceress, as the abandoned wife, as the child murderer. She knows her audience expects her to behave somewhat in line with her appearances in Euripides, in Ovid, or even in Apollonius. When Medea exclaims, "Medea super est," Medea remains, or "Fiam," I will be, or "Medea nunc sum," now I am Medea, she is speaking not only of her personal identity within the play, but also the identity built for her by a literary tradition spanning centuries. Medea constructs and becomes the Medea she has been scripted to be. Similarly, another Medea and Marcus are both conscious of the literary and theatrical tradition of which they are part of, as is evident in the very title of the play. Another Medea, of course, signals previous Medeas. The long shadow of the Colchian prince as sorceress appears even at the early stages of Marcus' relationship with Jason, when Marcus is offered to play in Charles Ludlam's Medea. He ominously tells Jason with excitement that in character he will be speaking his name over and over again. But as with Seneca's Medea, the exploration, construction, and enactment of the scripted role of Medea begins for Marcus just as he is abandoned and expelled by Jason. While alone and banished, Marcus begins to research the different stage and literary versions of Medea, including some of the most important performances in the stage reception of ancient tragedy, such as those by Fiona Shaw, Diana Rigg, Zoe Caldwell, Maria Callas, and continuing with the written versions, I read. First, the straightforward translations, the Rovison Jeffers that was done on Broadway, the one Judith Anderson did, and then the Jean Anouilh from the 40s. And then the plays that are more reinventions than adaptations, Neil LaBute's Medea Redux, a contemporary one-woman piece. And there's Ariel Dorfman's play Purgatorio, and there's The Golden Fleece by Pete Gunning, and there's Marina Carr's play By the Dog of Cats, an Irish version, one of the only ones I found written by a woman, curiously. And there's John Epperson's play My Dear, and there's Mary Christine, the Michael John Lacusis musical, and there's another one that was played by a man, Medea in the Laundromat by H.M. Kutukas, and so on and so forth. Tons of them, a disproportionate number of versions of this story. Both Another Medea and Marcus know their place in a long tradition to which they must respond and which they must satisfy, taking it a step further. What is most interesting to me and to the Queer Tragedy Project is that this gay Medea, both the play and the character, are aware also of their place amongst a substantial line of queer and camp Medeas, inciting and thus acknowledging not only Ludlam's Medea, the cross-dressed Medea that lurks in the shadows of this play, but also Kutuka's Medea in the Laundromat and Epperson's My Dear. The queer Medea tradition is very much honoured, retaken, and remained in this gay Medea again, even if Another Medea as a one-act narrative monologue leaves camp behind. But as said, Another Medea must honour its tragic stemma in taking the story a step further. It stylistically does this by presenting the story as a horror monodrama, as a grand guignol horror in the style of Spalding Gray, as the author describes it, in which actions are narrated in order to be vivified in the mind of its audience, as a theatre of the mind. In order for the potency of Medea to really unsettle us in this horror monodrama, Medea has to be brought down from the stage and the myth to everyday life. In focusing on real cases of infanticide, Another Medea shows that infanticide is something that can happen to ordinary people, including Marcus, including me, including you, including us all. In the tangible and real horror of infanticide, Medea appears as very much alive and walking amongst us, as the following words, which some might find upsetting, reveal. In Marcus' psychic trauma and vulnerability, in seeking a way out, even a role to play, myth, theatrical tradition, and criminal history have opened the door for the spirit of the sorceress, the filicide, the avenger Medea to take possession of Marcus. And so Marcus must play his role, killing his daughters, even taking it a step further in also killing Jason. Marcus only leaves Angelica, the biological mother of the children, alive, watching in frozen shock, as we all are. While killing Jason, Marcus claims an apparently anti-Medean statement. I am not Medea, he repeats, but it is too late. He is Medea. He has played a horrific role in his own real life of yet another Medea. As we have been able to see in this discussion, another Medea confronts us with the larger picture of potential and legal realities of gay couples, same-sex marriage, and parental rights. By exploring the negative possibilities of these issues, another Medea manages to bring to the fore the possibilities of a relationship gone wrong, the suffering of an abusive partner, and the lack of legal protection for same-sex partners and parents who find themselves in similar situations. In doing this, it reminds us that rights are not utopian dreams of better liberal societies, but the most prescient necessities of individuals that need guarantees and protections when they are exploited, harmed, and destroyed by others. Love is indeed the motor and aspiration of any partnership and couple, but another Medea makes us look at ourselves in a mirror reflecting love gone sour, wrong, and dark, so we can take action to guarantee that nobody remains unprotected in the face of such horrors. This protection would not necessarily prevent such acts. Marriage has not stopped any Medeas since mythical times. But our duty as a society is to ask ourselves, how can these horrors be prevented? And another Medea asks precisely the most uncomfortable questions. In the case of Marcus, marriage and its protection may have opened up alternatives. It may have helped him escape his isolation or share custody of his daughters, or it may even have prevented the infanticide. Marcus, as a gay man with the full protection of the law, may have been able to avoid becoming yet another Medea. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that thought-provoking and slightly unsettling presentation of an unsettling thing.
I'm sorry, I'm very sorry.
I'm going to invite my colleague Barbara Goff up here as our tragedy expert to lead the Q&A.
Can I ask for just while you say hello for me to go and get water?
That means he wouldn't get the first question.
Well, I'll say hello, and then if people want to put their hands up, then I can have a kind of working list, I guess, for when Oliver comes back. And I need to keep an eye on the online audience as well. Online audience, put questions in the chat, please, or raise your hand. Okay, Kirsty, I see you there. Just 1 minute, because Oliver is still getting his water. It's a stressful business, talking about Medea.
I have a question.
And you have a question as well. Okay, good.
He should have sent me to get his water.
I didn't think of that.
People know you'll do that.
I'm back.
Just in time, because the questions are piling up. Kirsty, would you like to come on mic, please, and ask your question?
Thank you, and thank you, Oliver. That was such an interesting discussion.
Thank you.
I wondered if, as you say, the sort of, if there's a parable for another Medea, it's, rights need to be protected, it's, very queer rights play. What would you therefore say the parody or the aim of the original Medea, either Euripides or Seneca, would be?
Ooh, how many decades of scholarship do you want?
I want your opinion.
My honest opinion is that the beauty perhaps is a bit too romantic way of looking at it, but the richness of Greco-Roman tragedy is actually that these things can be interpreted in many, many ways. So in the end, it could be Medea being too much. It could be Jason being too much. Does Jason deserve what Medea does? Doesn't Jason deserve what Medea does? Really don't know how to answer that question. Because I think I have gone through it so many times that the original opinion I had, which was that Jason was a bit of a weak bloke and that he should man up and he should respect his wife. I still vaguely think that, but I've read it so many times in so many different ways that I think many other things that contradict that. So I'm very sorry, but I don't think I have quite a clear answer to that.
That's fine, thank you.
What's yours, Christy?
Not in Medea particularly, but I'm interested in the idea of the festival as a very much state-sponsored event where, you know, it's not just art for art's sake, and it's not about artistic expression, it's about, you know, maintaining the status quo. So yeah, I wondered if queer tragedy as fighting for queer rights, which is against the status quo, was sort of directly flipping on its head ancient tragedy. And I'm specifically Greek, so I don't really know about, you know, later Senegal ones and stuff. But whether, yeah, the ancient was more about status quo and queer tragedy is more about flipping that on its head.
Yes and no. There is a seed in Greek tragedy which is precisely about, okay, so in order to map the framework of the status quo, some part of the status quo has to be questioned, and therefore, or has to be shown a dark side of the moon. It has to be shown that the negative side of it, and therefore, in that there might perhaps be a kernel of some sort of contestation of the status quo, or at least question of the status quo, which is, I think, is actually perhaps, well, not perhaps, it is one of the things that, of course, the 20th century has used from Greek tragedy. It's particularly interested in how come that suddenly you have these extremely strong women who are making very important points, like Medea and Euripides, of course, with the Women of Corinth speech. So, I'm not 100% sure that one can read Greek tragedy as precisely some sort of status quo propaganda. I think it's both. I think it's complicated in both those two ways. And in a way, queer tragedy can also do that, because queer tragedy can also think about normative institutions and therefore homonormative ways of looking at those institutions that in a way are status quo to come, if you know what I mean. So I think the beauty of it is that it is complicated and that there's all of these different things coexisting at the same time.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cozy. Amy, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. Since I'm here in this space, I don't know how close I have to come to be heard. And I'm bringing my page with me because I kept on rewriting my question as we went along. But I was interested, actually, from the beginning. You stumbled. It was, I think, the only time that in your very fluid presentation that you stumbled when you were listing all the issues that it brings up. And you said, of course, paternity, and you threw in there maternity, and then you corrected that to something else, like maternity's got nothing to do with it. And later on, I realized maternity does have nothing to do with it, because they're fighting about who's the dad. There is no fight about who the woman is, which makes this an interesting case in terms of parental, rights and blah, 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 because they both completely agree that Angie's the mom. But that highlights that this is not about gender performativity. And way back in the old days, I don't even want to call it queer tragedy, but gay, whenever the cinema or television or whatever dealt with gay or queer, they dealt with gender performativity. It was like, oh, this one's playing the mom and this one's playing the dad and blah, blah, blah. And do you think that in this case, that's not an issue because A, gender performativity isn't the most important thing or the only thing to do with queer tragedy anymore anyway, which is true, or because if we think back to Medea, she's also or they, she and Jason, are also playing the role of both doing feminine things and both doing masculine things? Is it trying to highlight that? Or is it because, as I think you summed up, or the author is trying to unsettle us and sort of put us all in, and that is unsettling if we're thinking they're both being dad and they're both not being mom. There's no discussion in everything that you gave me. There was no discussion about maternity, about mom roles.
No, there's no discussion because in a way for the play, and I'm talking specifically on dramatic terms, Angelica is a Macduff. So Angelica is a necessary tool in order for the rest of the story to work. Of course, she is a complicated tool precisely because there's never been a pre-existing arrangement in who is the father and how their father, who actually is the parent, the legal parent, I should say, rather than father, except for Angelica, who is the biological mother. And because there has been no surrogacy agreement, she is the biological mother and therefore the legal mother and the legal parent. Now, I don't think that is that is just casual. I have a feeling, but this is my reading, that Jason sees this very clearly. And Jason sees that by not creating an arrangement and seeing that Marcus has not registered himself as donor father, that in the end, Angelica will be the legal parent. And because she is dependent on him and he has the economic means, he de facto will be father. So I think that is the way that arrangement is done. I don't think that the arrangement is done in a way to deconstruct parenting as we know it, including parenting in cases of same-sex couples. I don't think that's exactly what it's doing. Now, when it comes to the performativity of gender, we are constantly performing gender. So are they doing this? I think they are. I think very clearly. I think actually Jason, the character of Jason, is very much performing the gender of heterosexist norms of successful man, including, I must say, the manipulative side and including the economically tyrannical side, if you want to call it that. I probably need to think a bit more how to describe that. So I do think that there is a gender performativity there. There is a gender performativity to a certain extent in Marcus, but Marcus is performing he's performing a subject position that is based on how Jason treats him. So he is taking in a way the role of the abused wife, but not because Marcus himself identifies like that, but because the structure of heterosexist toxic masculinity forces him to take that subject position, but not because he actually identifies as that. Now, are they both identify as men and behave as men? Yes, they do. And so therefore it is also gender performativity. Are they exploring perhaps, and this is the interesting bit, are they perhaps queering normative gender? Are they queering, what's the word? Binary gender, that's what I wanted. Are they queering binary gender? Perhaps they are to a certain, perhaps the play is to a certain extent. But I think it does that in precisely playing with our perception that abusive relationships happen from a man to a woman. And as soon as we are shown that this can happen from a man to a man, we suddenly think, oh, is this abuse coming from our perception that there is an imbalance of power, cultural perception of imbalance of power, or is they really come from the fact that there is a toxic masculinity at play? And I think it's the latter. Now, there was another thing about, oh yes, Medea and Jason, performing kind of two genders. And this is the most interesting thing. And I think this is really why Medea is so, Medea the play, and principally Euripides' Medea, because Seneca Medea appears kind of as footnotes and in order to think primarily about identity, because of course you've got these wonderful statements of now I am Medea, etc., that playwrights really like. But in Euripides' Medea, precisely Medea is in this liminality of gender position. But again, as I was saying before, I do not think that that liminality, that questioning, is in itself a deconstruction. I think it is just playing with the margins, pushing the margins. It might be what we now call queering, in the sense that it is questioning her own femininity or her own femaleness and Jason's maleness, but that is a questioning, a fissuring, not necessarily a deconstructing and debunking, if that makes any sense. Good.
Thank you. Yes.
Rachel, go ahead.
I'm going to keep with the issue of gender performativity, if that's okay.
Yes.
You could argue that another Medea is losing one of the strongest and most forceful aspects of Euripides' Medea, which is the fact that Medea is structurally oppressed as a biological woman,
Yeah.
and that there is a lot of gendered language used against her, which focuses on, and by her, which focuses on the biological aspect of femaleness, such as, you know, the bit where she talks about she'd rather fight in battle 3 times than give birth once. Did you mention that there were trans Medeas?
Yes.
Tell me about those. How do they deal with issues of gender identity and biogender and socially constructed gender?
I'm afraid that right now I cannot talk to you about that, because that's a list, that's a line on a list. So I have not actually gone into it enough. I do know from the quick review I was reading as I was deciding if this should be on the list or not, which is primarily the Italian trans Medea, which happened, I think, in 2005. The idea is precisely her positionality as strange woman. And what in the case of Medea, her strangeness comes from her origin. In the case of this trans Medea, and I repeat, this is only one review I have read, it is understood as also a question of origins from their sex assigned at birth, which is male. So in that sense, that's all I can tell you about that. Now, I can tell you about another trans adaptation of queer tragedy, which is Trojan Women, in which Hecuba is a trans woman, is a trans mother of this queer family, which are the group of the Trojan Women. And in that case, it is primarily about defending from the attacks of transphobia that she receives her own subject positionality as woman. That's as far as I can tell you with the trans issues. Now, when it comes to has another Medea perhaps missed a trick, or perhaps kind of by not making Medea a woman stripped it from those connotations? Yes, it has, but it perhaps has gained others that, of course, Euripides' Medea or Seneca's Medea did not have. Oh yes, and TERFs do appear a lot in these versions. Primarily, this trans Trojan women I was talking about. There is a character who's playing Menelaus. She's actually called Helena, but she's playing the character Menelaus. She attacks Hecuba precisely on transphobic terms, intertrophic terms. So
I'm just checking on the online audience to see if anyone's got their hand up or is going in the chat. I'm not seeing that currently. Anybody in the room? Yeah, Harrison?
When Marcus makes reference to Goebbels, he leaves out Joseph Goebbels' role in killing the children. Why do you think he chooses to focus on just Goebbels?
I don't know. I think that it fits Marcus' identification with the mother role to a certain extent. But I repeat, that identification is not his identification, it's the identification to which he has been put by Jason. But I think that precisely in that position in which he's already been put, he identifies a lot clearer with, of course, Medea, and therefore with other mothers that do the same kind of thing. Yeah.
And Summer, please. Kind of leading on from that. Early on in your discussion, there was a point where Marcus speaks about his mother, generational trauma, saying my mother never had this either, and identifying what typically and is often portrayed as female generational trauma. So my mother didn't have a city partner, I won't either.
Yes.
Told me that.
Yes.
I wonder if that plays into his identification with Magda as well, where it's almost queering past generational trauma as both a victim and then as an actor of.
Yes, I think, yes, definitely. But of course, there is such a thing as cross-gender identification. I mean, there is such a thing as people who identify as men being able to identify with some aspects of people who identify as women, and vice versa. So I think in that sense, yes, probably there is some of that. The mother appears in two key moments. One at the very beginning, which I think is just, in a way, a quick illustration of this. I'm not criticizing the author, but a quick mention of a homophobic mother. Later she appears precisely, and this is very much like Seneca's Medea, at the moment in which she's doubting, and she calls for her brother, and her brother appears and in front of her, kind of in her mind's eye. And Marcus, to stop himself, he tries to call his mother. And on the other side, there's a man who has that number, but the mother's nowhere to be seen. And I think in that case, the mother is playing a role of constant absence, which I think is just there, in my opinion, just for, and of course we can do other readings, but just for dramatic purposes of Marcus not to have any escape. But yes, of course, yes, there's such a thing as cross-gender identifications, and I think that's there. Now, does that then seed in perhaps to Marcus's identification precisely with female experience and female perspectives? Yes, very probably, yes.
And Jo.
Yeah. So obviously, the play itself kind of doesn't shy away from referencing back to the ancient Medea.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering how much time, quite long, sorry. Do you think that kind of adds or detracts from the ultimate horror? Like, we know this play is related to Medea, so we kind of know where it's going to go with the children. Does that add or detract? And in that case, does that then kind of attempt to contribute to the understanding that this, like the play tries to show, that this can kind of happen to anyone? And by doing that, does that kind of then attempt to establish a history of this for the LGBTQIA community?
No, it's okay. The first question, whether it adds or detracts, I think it adds. And the reason why it's doing this is actually, again, a dramatical reason. This is a monodrama. That means that there's only one actor doing all of this. That actor needs as much help as he can get in order to spook the rest of us. And one of the way that is done is precisely by saying, here's what's coming. Yes. And so people start thinking, how is he going to do it? Yes. And so it builds up the tension. I think if Medea was not there, it would be dramatically just a person who at the very end goes, and kills the children. I'm oversimplifying it, but that would be in the end what it would be. And of course, you would still be like, oh God, what have I seen? But the fact that Medea is there, always lurking in the background, works towards building this tension. And also it does another thing, which is what I was trying to hint at also in my discussion, that Greco-Roman tragedy works also, and is one of the rich uses of it, as a sort of stylistic duel with the tradition. So new versions try to outdo, do differently, play with what other people have done before. And this is precisely what it's doing. So if Medea were not there and you did not have this list of different theatrical Medeas, of which some of them are they even wear kind of, ancient costume, you would not have the possibility of saying, okay, there's all of these different ways. How are you going to do it? And then that also creates an expectation that then is fulfilled. And actually, it's rather horrific. So I think that's the way that works, at least dramatically. To the story, I think it also adds a little tension of, isn't he going to do it? This playing with Medea, but not quite what is going on here. And I think that probably also helps. Now, talking about that, I've forgotten the other 2 points, which are very interesting.
So I did that by kind of referencing Medea, it's creating this connection and further establishing, like it kind of does with the way he's listing with these cases of actual infanticide, kind of establishing that this can happen to anyone kind of crossing their heterosexual boundaries. And then by doing that, is he then establishing a history of this doesn't just happen in heteronormative relationships, but also in...
Yes, by bringing it to reality, precisely what it's doing is trying to spook us completely. Because of course, one of the reasons why theatre sometimes works so well, precisely for us to think about issues, is precisely that there is a certain separation between what is happening on stage and what is happening to us in our day-to-day. And by kind of trying to break down that wall, that works precisely in thinking, okay, this is not Medea, this is this man from Texas, is this, what? And there's a moment when there's a kid killed in a microwave, and it's like all of these images are thrown at you precisely to make you feel like, okay, this is reality, this is happening, this is horror, this is gore, this is real horror and gore. And I think in that way it also helps. Now, I don't think it is by doing a kind of LGBTQ reading of precisely that list, which I don't think Marcus does, but we could do. I doubt very much that what it's trying to do is some way create a model or an example of how people should behave. These are abhorrent cases, and it's very much shown like that. But what it might do is precisely what the play might be doing. It's precisely what it does from the beginning, which is thinking that these sort of behaviors are not necessarily graphed into the binaries of binary and gender, that this is not women who are doing it, that there's also men, and he is a man himself. So therefore, this is more to do with the mental situation of all of these people, the different circumstances, etc. Having said that, it's probably because it suits the play, it's missing some of the specificities of the way women kill their children and the way men kill their children, and the reasons why women kill their children and the reason why men kill their children. Women tend to kill their children within the first 5 days of the separation, and they tend to do it in the most, as far as they can, in the most benign way for the children. Fathers tend not to do that, and fathers tend to then commit suicide. So the idea then is that actually the greatest example of revenge, and perhaps an example precisely of toxic masculinity, is in the men committing filicide. But of course that doesn't suit the story, because in that way Marcus would become the toxic man instead of being a victim of toxic masculinity. But that is, if you know a bit about it, that is lurking somewhere there. And perhaps it helps to make it more uncomfortable even. The fact that you're suddenly thinking, oh, things have turned. But that is what is interesting precisely about the story of Medea, kind of where do we stand? And this is precisely doing that completely.
You just check in with the online audience. All right, online audience, I'm sure you'll have a question in a minute. Hannah, I think you've got a question.
I was wondering about
Yeah.
one thing, but maybe that is a question for your ongoing project.
Yeah.
Because we're looking at a fascinating example of a range of Medeas illustrated in display and then more generally pursued in your research.
Yeah.
And toxic masculinity
Yes.
plays an immense role here.
Yeah.
How it gets turned against
Yeah.
essentially many different people.
Yeah.
Now the question is Medea enabling an exploration of toxic relationships on a more general, even broader scale? I'm not sure, you may have mentioned it, I apologize if I missed it. Has anybody experimented with essentially making a heterosexual portrait where Jason is a woman?
Oh, yes, those have existed. So they to the last question, there was a play, and perhaps Barbara will remember a bit better than I do with what I'm going to say. There was a play on the BBC, 1970s, 1980s, or something like that, in which the Medea was a man, and they were a Jamaican couple, if I remember well. They were a Jamaican couple, and she went off with another man, and that's how it all worked out. Which of course was taking the idea also of, well, primarily was exploiting the idea of Medea as foreigner rather than displaced, rather than a gender reading. So those have existed. And I think there's a few more, but at least I can tell you that one did exist in the UK. Now, the first question, in this specific play, it is toxic masculinity. What is happening, or what I'm seeing, and in a way it's understandable, throughout researching queer tragedy, is that one of the things that tragedy does is precisely think about conflict. And therefore it thinks about rule. I mean, this is maybe a very Hegelian way of looking at it, but kind of, thesis and antithesis. And, and the fact that there's a conflict between two ways of reading a same situation. And usually one is a normative position, the other one is a non-normative position. That is how most of Greek tragedy works. This is what is happening in the case of most of queer tragedy. And I think that is one of the reasons why Greco-Roman tragedy is so attractive precisely to LGBTQ theatre makers, because it is about thinking about the norm and how not to fit the norm, and how the norm fights against the change, and how the change fights against the norm. So in this case, it's definitely toxic masculinity. In the case, for example, of the gay Medea of 1981 in Spain, Medea es un buen chico, it's only, the characters are only Medea and the nurse. And what they're fighting against is precisely the world outside their bedroom, which is heteronormativity, in which Medea is displaced from her position as gay partner to Jason in favor of a heterosexual wife in Glauce. But you see, the interpretation of what the norm is and how the norm behaves, and what the non-normative is and behaves, changes, but in the end, it is a conflict about that. You also find it in the trans Trojan women I was explaining about before. You do have, this happens in a hospital in which they are, the family, the Trojan women family, are being attacked by something like AIDS, and everyone outside of the stage is precisely the economic, gender, and racial normativities, and those on stage are precisely the non-normativity. And it is in that clash where it works. So definitely that is at the heart of all of this. Now, more examples about toxic masculinity in other plays? Not really, at least not as developed as they are in another Medea, but definitely heteronormativity in conflict with non-normativity, non-gender normativity is definitely there. that's in a way the point.
We have a question from Olga in our online audience.
Hello, Olga.
Thank-
It must be extremely early for you guys. Sorry.
Thank you for this fantastic talk, Olga says. Thinking about your work on toxic masculinity and the hegemonic structures of gender binaries, can you talk more about what these hegemonic structures are in the original versus the adaptation?
Thank you. Of course, I think they exist. You've asked a very tricky question, Olga, because you're going to make me talk about ancient drama and gender normativities. And this is a bit complicated, as you well know. Many people have discussed that we cannot read our own ideas of gender binaries and heteronormativity into antiquity, and therefore we should not be reading it into Greco-Roman drama. And I think that is true, but to a certain extent. By that I mean that usually the examples given is that Greece and Rome do not make the difference precisely on a question of gender as such, but they have other ways of distinguishing. Principally, the question of penetrator and penetrated, which is the big example. But I have doubts on whether that shows that Greco-Roman conceptions of gender are all that different. By that I mean that does not show that there's no binary. What that shows is that the binary is conceived in a different way, but in the end the binary exists, and the binary follows things that are certainly comparable with the way that we have constructed heteronormativity. So in that sense, there is a question of the normative positionality, the normative power positionality in Jason and in Creon, precisely dispelling and displacing the normatively weak subject positionality of Medea. Or said in other ways, if we want to think about the penetrator and the penetrator, in the end it is in a way configured as the penetrators displacing the penetrated. So I think that there is something there, but we need to do a lot of work on precisely thinking about this new paradigm of reading questions of gender in antiquity. And this is by no means, please do not quote me, because this is just me thinking out loud about how these issues really work. Now, precisely that question of normative power in gender terms and normative non-power in gender terms, of course, is taken directly from Jason/Creon to Jason in another Medea, and from Medea to Marcus in this play. But it's also doing the same in many other examples of the Medea, but also many other examples of the Antigone. It's doing it in many other ways. So that's, I think, my tentative answer to a question that is quite complicated, and it will probably take me another 20 years to truly formulate properly. Yes.
Cool question. We've hit our end time.
Ooh,
Oh,
okay.
First time ever.
So we have. So if anybody wants to jump in with a quick question from the online audience, or indeed from the room audience. Yes, Diana, quick question.
Yeah, it struck me that the roles of Medea and Jason have been swapped in Marcus and Jason, in that Medea is the intelligent, manipulative one, whereas in the other Medea it's more Jason. Got any thoughts?
Yeah. I agree that aspect is there, and it's very interesting. I'd have to think further on that. I don't think, however, but of course this, you know, this is just because that's the reading I've been doing for a very long time. But I don't think it quite inverts the thing completely. It does perhaps complicate it in that way, but I'm not sure it kind of contradicts it completely. But it's quite, it is quite interesting, and you're definitely right. The manipulative one is to a certain extent Medea. But of course, you also say that because we haven't spoken about, and I have avoided speaking about the end of the play in which Marcus is organizing the killing. So at that point, Marcus is definitely playing Medea. But it is interesting. It is curious that in a way the passive one is Jason, and the clever and active one is Medea in the play, and that here it's yeah, interesting. Thank you.
So that's great. So you've left us with a cliffhanger. How does he organise the murder of his children?
Good question.
Oh, I have another question. All right, thank you.
Oh, not a question, but a remark. Remarks.
Okay, good.
Maybe Oliver, you could read them out.
Okay, so let's go to the direct to the comment. I think classical tragedies on Medea have important issues such as the problem of the integration of foreigner people and the contrast between the patriarchal society and the affirmation of a woman. Also criticized for her strong male attitudes. Good. I think the lines to that's of course all in Latin. You could probably all see it. The ideas and prospects presented today were different but interesting. So thank you, Denise, for coming. Thank you, Denise. Next time I am in Naples, we can go and have a glass of wine. Be a pleasure.
Okay, that's great. The thought of a glass of wine, I think, is another good place on which we end. Thank you so much, Oliver, for such a stimulating talk. And thanks both audiences for your questions.
Thank you.